The next speaker we are very fortunate to have in Kansas City, and very fortunate to have here. He's been a great partner. His name is Dr. David Renz. He is the Beth K. Smith Missouri Chair in Nonprofit Leadership and the Director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership in the Henry W. Block School of Management at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. That's a lot. When people have a long title, that means that they're doing really, really good work. David teaches and conducts research on nonprofit and public service leadership, especially governance and board effectiveness. He was in government himself and was a nonprofit leader, so he is using that experiences in his work today. He has worked with more than 150 boards, commissions, and networks over the past 2 decades. With that, I'm going to give him time to do his thing. So let's welcome David Renz. Thank you.
Thank you. This is great. Usually when they stand up at the beginning, they just head for the exit, so this is wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, and it's been a real pleasure and privilege to be working with with Children's Mercy and the Weighing In Initiative. We've had a connection with them for about 6 years now, starting with some early planning work that we did with many of you who are in the room. As you heard, I lead the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership, which is, I won't go through all those layers again. By the time people hear that stuff, they wonder if we're going to announce the galaxy we're in and things like that too. But there are lots of layers to this stuff. My take is, I think, going to be complimentary. I'll actually hop over a couple of the slides in the presentation simply because they will be too duplicative of what Dr. Salas talked about. But I think this is going to be an interesting and useful bridge. And then as Robin shares some of the specific work on the research that grew out of the kind of thinking I'm going to share with you, hopefully this will add a new complement as well as reinforce many of the things you've heard. Now, I'm not a health professional. I was one of the people who raised a hand when you asked that question. My background is organizational theory and design, and in fact, I look a lot at change and community change and system change. I am a former government official. I tell people sometimes, I'm very proud of my government service, but I do say sometimes I'm a recovering bureaucrat. People have wondered if that's a 12-step program, but it turns out it's 24 steps. There are a lot of forms to complete. But my work and the way I'm thinking about systems and specifically system change, which was what I heard Robin inviting me to look at and think about in the context of what Dr. Salas was talking about. My work, for those of you in the health world, I've sometimes told folks I'm a bureau pathologist. And so I'm all about looking at the bureaus, the organizations, the organizing, and what it is that's going on. Now, actually, I should probably just ask right now to get a sense of the audience. Are there any here who are familiar with the martial art of Aikido? Raise your hand if you are. Okay, so I've got to be careful because I'm going to talk about Aikido, and I only use it as a metaphor. I know nothing about it other than the core principles, but I actually think that's really critical and significant when we're thinking about system change. And all of the things that you were talking about in aggregate are about system change if we're trying to move in the direction of addressing childhood obesity. And so Aikido is this primarily self-defense martial art, and the great thing about it is that it's, it's a Far Eastern philosophy and practice. It is about understanding and recognizing and then leveraging the flow of forces in play. And that's a theme through what I'm talking about today. If we want to change the systems we're in, we need to understand those systems, and we'll be talking some elements about that. But we also need to think then about, well, how do they intersect and react? And if we want it to be different, how do we leverage the forces that are in play? Because those forces are there, they're myriad. You talked about a huge array of them, and I'm going to make it even messier with a couple more. So the essence of the Aikido perspective, if you watch Aikido masters, it's actually like they're dancing. It's so smooth. They intuitively see a force coming at them if somebody were coming to attack them, and they say, oh, well, the force is coming this way. So one of the principles is we'll embrace that force, but also be flexible. It's coming at me, so the Aikido master will actually grab the person who's about to attack them, but they'll also move out of the way and help that person keep going in the direction they're going. They're not trying to redirect the forces, they're trying to embrace them in a way that can be productive. Understanding the nature and flow of the forces, to me, is critical in system change. Now, system, quick refresher, just, you all have experience, and in fact, part of the fun when I started working with Weighing In was working with a lot of people who think from a systems perspective. The health world has been very effective at embracing this, public health in particular, but we look at it in a complementary but sometimes slightly different perspective. Just a couple of reminders about systems, and by the way, we're all living in systems. Health, childhood obesity, that's a system that nobody in their right mind would intentionally design, but it's still a system because it has stability, it has balance, it's interconnected, and one of the implications of that is everything affects everything else. And so if we're trying to change that system and we do a little bit of something, it doesn't actually have any impact because all the other forces in the system push it back to the stability that systems inherently want. If we can exercise enough leverage in the right ways, in the right places at the right time, that's where we have the opportunity to really change what it is that's going on, because these systems have feedback loops, and so every change, every balancing act that we engage in has an impact, or ideally has an impact. Now, the truth is, I didn't create this diagram, but I always thought it was a great example of how the world we work in, we live in a shared power world. Command and control structures and approaches to fixing problems, they just don't work. They don't happen. And so the bad news is, in America and many parts of the world, mostly what we've shared is veto power. We get in the way of each other all the time. We stop things from happening. The leadership dimension of this that is about designing and then orchestrating systems development, evolution to be more healthy and effective is to go beyond the veto power and actually share that power to make things happen. That said, we need to be able to see systems in order to understand which forces are in play and what's happening to them. And so, this is a typical public health or a typical public problem that we're dealing with. We often refer to them in my work as wicked problems. Wicked because no matter what you want to talk about with that problem, there are multiple layers, there are multiple sectors, nobody's got enough leverage to make it happen. We've got to work together. You've heard the phrase, it takes a village. Well, if you want to achieve system change, it takes a network. We need to connect. It's one of the things that's marvelous about you being here and what's going on in these dialogues here, because every one of us and a whole lot of folks who are not here are engaged in actions that have an impact on that system, but at their worst, we get very frustrated because the energy we invest in making the change has no discernible value. Now, sometimes there's a time lag and eventually it does, but a lot of times it doesn't because we're not orchestrating the forces and leveraging them in ways that make a significant difference. So what does it mean when we're facilitating system change? To begin with, it's a journey. So it starts with being able to see the system. And as Robin will share with you later, some of the work we did in the early days, and we're doing it in a couple of areas, is mapping a system, trying to figure out what is out there, what are the forces that are in play, what forces are working for us, which are benign, which are working against us. And then what do we do with that? Now, the truth is, it's hard to see those systems, and sessions like this are great, and frankly, presentations such as we just heard, I think, are beneficial because it helps us recognize what sometimes doesn't seem like anything that's coherent or organized, when in fact there is a coherence to it, even if we don't like what it adds up to. And so, one of the jargon phrases in the leadership world is, we need to go to the balcony, and that's in essence what you're doing today, to understand what it is we're trying to deal with in terms of a system. The metaphor of going to the balcony, if you're at the Sprint Center or at a concert or a game or whatever else, while you're on the floor, the basketball floor, the court, whatever, at the ground level, you see whatever it is that you're connecting with. And there's a whole lot that you don't see until you can move to the balcony. Some of you have been through leadership programs, have heard this stuff before. It's Heifetz and Linsky, it's basic stuff. But it's the stuff we need to remember. Go to the balcony and you see different patterns. You see all this other stuff that actually will have an impact, at least some of it will, on you, but you can't see it. You can't tell what's really going on when you're on the floor or at ground level. So mapping the system is about going to the balcony. By the way, I'm going to hop through some of these slides just because they're overlaps with things that you've already seen. So understanding that system, and frankly, we can't control the system. We have to facilitate and enable change. And so one of the mind shifts that a lot of the folks who work in this domain talk about is moving away from reacting to what's going on to co-creating the next generation. We need to be bridging across boundaries, and that's one of the things that's really a significant challenge. One of the things that's great about the issue of childhood obesity is there are so many people working on so many things, and frankly, it's been great to see some of the statistics. I'm not a child health professional, so I see these statistics more as an outsider, but some of the statistics in the region. Childhood obesity is not getting worse. In some respects, you've made some phenomenal progress. But lots of different things going on. We need to be working across boundaries. We need to be figuring out how do we engage in regular inquiry and interaction among each other so that the way we co-create is by collaborating with each other. And shared leadership is how it happens. One of the methods that you may have heard of, some of you have probably seen this, there's an approach called collective impact. A consulting firm working with a bunch of foundations, the firm is FSG, actually developed this model, but it kind of got away from them because it actually makes sense to a lot of people when they think about it. When communities are coming together to address one of these wicked problems, one of my British colleagues tells me that I've got the name wrong, they're pernicious problems in his jargon. Either way, how do you address, as a community, bringing lots of different actors together to deal with a wicked, diffuse, complicated problem? How do we do that? Well, this notion of collective impact has principles. You can do them in lots of ways. And candidly, initiatives in town like Weighing In play roles like this. There are some others as well. One of the challenges in communities is you sometimes have competing actors who each say, well, we're the collective impact actor. We're the backbone who's going to make it all happen. And so then you get fights about, well, who's really in charge? And that, of course, absorbs energy that could otherwise be invested in other ways. But the essence of these community system change initiatives, the characteristics they articulate are, first of all, we come together around a common agenda. Because if you don't have a common agenda, you may have some impact, but it's not going to be an aggregate about the things you're really trying to deal with. Working from that agenda, then the question is, well, how do we judge whether we've made any difference? And you are very familiar, most of you, with the kinds of statistics that have been shared, the studies and so on that are going on in town, but we need to do more. But here's the point. This is all system level stuff, not just at the individual level. And ironically, one of the things that can get in the way is we can become so good at the details in our own shop that we don't connect to the bigger picture, strategic, overarching, bridge-building domain that's out there. So what is the shared measurement system that all of us working together on this initiative will agree are the best ways? Now, the good thing about the health world, candidly, as compared to some others, is that it's easier to articulate what those shared measures are than it is in some other parts of the sort of social cultural change domain. We need mutually reinforcing activities. Every one of you is doing some things. We can't all do each and everything individually, but by coming together and knowing what the system is, and then when we go through this system mapping process, part of the point of it is, well, where do we actually not have anybody doing something that would have an impact on some critical force or set of forces in the system? We have to be in communication with each other because this is a dynamic environment and things keep shifting. And the essence of collective impact, as I said, sometimes you get folks who are pretenders arguing about, well, who gets to be what? But we need to have a backbone which is an orchestrator. And this is not a backbone in the sense of a leadership or a leadership actor calling the shots. The backbone is the infrastructure to facilitate things. Candidly, Children's Mercy convening a summit with the support of the governmental and other actors who are here. That's a backbone type of activity. Sometimes, well, to go back to the point I made earlier, in a shared power world, trying to do these things through a command and control, let me tell you how it will happen, basically creates problems and fights and absorbs energy that undermines actual impact on the change we're trying to make. So we need facilitators. Sometimes I think the metaphor I like most is that of a catalyst in a chemical reaction. The backbone at its best enables collective action. It enables a reaction and result, a synthesis that couldn't have happened otherwise, but at the end of the time, there's no residual of the backbone. It's all still the community, the collective, but the system has evolved to its new level. Now, the truth is, there are 4 key things that affect whether we are able to come together and make this happen. Part of it is what's going on at the beginning of starting to work together. Part of it is how good are we at formal, but especially the informal processes by which we work together and collaborate. This is one of the most critical issues, and I'm going to come back to it a little bit more in a second, but the third critical issue is the constraints or opportunities that exist around the logic systems. One of the most challenging characteristics of system change is that you've got all sorts of professionals and practitioners from all sorts of places, and they each speak their own language. They're all working toward the same outcome, but they sometimes are using different words. Sometimes they're using the same words and it means different things. And the challenge with logics, slide won't go, there we go. The challenge with logics is that when you have multiple logic or heuristic systems, decision-making systems, by the way, it's how do we do things around here? A colleague of ours named John Bryson was writing about this. He's one of the folks who's in public administration has studied how networks and systems collectively move to change and reconfigure what's going on. His observation, which I think explains extremely well the challenge, is that when you have different logic structures or different logic systems, actions, procedures, structures that make sense, they're legitimate or even preferred, speak, by the way, best practices, from the point of one institutional logic, may be fundamentally different or even illegitimate from the perspective of another logic. One of the most challenging groups I ever facilitated here in Kansas City in my work at the Midwest Center was when we were dealing with a session after some problems with at-risk children and frankly some children who'd been seriously hurt occurred, and a group of people across town said, we can't let this happen again. We've got to come together. You know, when you bring police officers, judges, probation officers, teachers, social workers, city officials, park officials, when you bring in, by the way, another dozen categories, when you put them all in a room, they're not speaking the same thing, even when they care fundamentally about making a difference with regard to the critical issue. In that case, making sure that nobody ever got hurt the way this scandal in town turned out. And one of the challenges of bridging and communication is that the logics get in the way of us connecting and communicating. And I'll say candidly, one of the things that's a problem is the more you train us, and you know, I'm grossly overtrained, I've got a PhD, which, yeah, means piled higher and deeper. At least that's what the family told me when I got it. So, you know, we're so ingrained and so good at the slice we're in that we lose sight of the bigger slice. Now, when we're working on a problem that's inside that domain, that's great. When we're bridging, connecting to achieve system change across multiple actors in a diffuse system, we got to be able to bridge and connect. There are layers. And, you know, these relate very closely to Dr. Salas's, although, by the way, I'm struck, it's always struck me as interesting, not being a quote-unquote health professional, even though I've worked on the edges of this domain a lot. The top of that ecological model regularly is discussed as policy change. You all know policy change happens inside of a larger circle, a larger dynamic. Now, we try to make those policy changes, but they happen in the context of larger systems. And again, one of the challenges with systems is it's not that it's good or bad, they just are. But if we don't leverage, if we don't identify and then leverage the forces in play, and those services, those processes are in play at multiple levels. We have some of us in the room who are doing direct service to individuals. We have others who are in education. There's the physical infrastructure. Advocacy, law, and policy is yet another layer, and even larger than that, and this is where, in theory, a community's collective impact notion and system change could happen, is around this coordination and monitoring. But we need to be thinking about how do these connect, and we need to work together. One of the things that people often do, and it depends on the profession you're in and to some extent your personal dynamics, your personal sort of style, if you will. Some people look at formal systems and structures. I appreciated that you were talking about being a psychologist. Every field has its own sort of layer of perception and intervention in the system. If you're a psychologist, excuse me, I shouldn't be speaking for you, Dr. Salles, but if you're a psychologist or social psychologist, you're looking at individuals in small groups. If you're an organization theory guy with a lot of sociology like I do, you're looking at organizations and organized units and sometimes communities in that sense. If you're an anthropologist, you're looking at cultures. All of those elements are going on, even if we don't see them or think about them or haven't been trained to look at them. So there are formal systems and structures, the things we can and can't start. There are the social and physical dimensions of the environment. And then there's the actual individual and small group, family, neighborhood types of stuff, which is about behaviors and practices at the individual level. One of the things that's depressing to most policy analysts and organization designers that I've met is that they do all of this redesign at the formal system level, and it makes no difference, except on the superficial level. I've been working on transformational change initiatives for, I guess, 35 or 40 years. And if there's anything I've learned, it's the truth of a cliche, presumably or reportedly uttered by a guy named Peter Drucker, father of modern management science. Culture will eat strategy for lunch any day, or maybe every day. What's the larger culture? And by the way, we have cultures in our professions, we have cultures in our communities, we have cultures in our governmental systems. You could argue that part of what happened at the last federal election is a referendum on how much do we need or want to change that culture. Now, by the way, just a clue, Robin's going to be getting into this in more depth, but the formal system, when we did the mapping in town, formal systems, we mapped all the programs that existed to work on childhood obesity in one way or another, at least all those who claimed they were. And the formal systems and structures, about 40% of the folks who were doing something said they were working to at least some degree in that. More were working on the social and physical environment because it was about the environment, the peer networks, organizational and professional development, things like that. This is where the culture lives. And then individual stuff that's going on. All those are going on. And in fact, if we go back to the systems level leverage notion, we have to work at the individual level. We have to work at the policy level. But these things all interconnect. And to go back to a point I made earlier on and just be real explicit, if you try to achieve system change by changing one thing, unless that change is so powerful that everything else has to adapt to it, everything else in the system will force it back to the way it was. So you have to have individual change. You have to have what's going on with small groups and peer groups. You have to have neighborhood stuff. We've got this. This is the system that you'll be hearing people talk about throughout the conference. In some respects, this is what we're looking at, but we see some additional layers that complement what's there. Now, just to wrap up, we mapped the childhood obesity system. When you think about those categories that I just described, you can graph them, and we did. This is literally the progression of a conceptual mapping that we did in town. Across the top, you see those three things I was just talking about. Formal systems, the social and physical infrastructure and environment, the parks, all the city stuff that you were just talking about. And then we have the actual behavior of individual people. All three of those exist, and to some extent, things will intersect across them, but you typically will find, for example, that formal systems don't affect many aspects of individual behaviors and practices. I mean, one of the things that I always thought was a classic strategy when dealing with anemia and sickle cell anemia was if you want to go interact with and actually understand and shape the attention of black men in the community, one of the places that you would be smart to go is a barbershop. Now, the truth is, I'm going to pass a policy to affect that health condition, and if I don't pay attention to what's going on at the street level in the barbershop, I may not have a key piece of what's going to make that system evolve and change. So at the societal and macro level, you've got national health authorities and policies, even global in some cases. You've got the food industry policies, things Dr. Salas talked about earlier on. On the behavior stuff, you've just got national trends. Still can't figure out why the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge ever caught on. Talk about a dumb fundraising thing. By the way, it raised billions of dollars. And everybody misunderstood what was going on there because they kept saying, gee, how do we replicate that? It wasn't about the ice bucket. It was all about the other things going on there. But there are trends, and so if the trends are against you, you have to pay attention to that. And then we have the things that are going on at the metropolitan or regional level. You've got state health and zoning. Of course, in Kansas City, we've got 2 states, so that makes it more interesting. We have regional coordination entities, Mid-America Regional Council, and the things that they do or others working with them do. You have your health systems, policies, and practices. By the way, policies and practices are all in the formal systems. Now, some of them are designed to change the infrastructure, the environment, or the behaviors, but they live here. Now, we also have institutional norms and practices, and this goes back to that professional logics model. Every field has its own definition of what is and isn't important, what is good and what is not. None of them are inherently right or wrong if you don't know what their impact is on the system. And then we added the neighborhood and community level. What's going on with the county? What's going on with municipal zoning? And schools kind of live in the cross-section of neighborhood and family. Sometimes they'll be in metropolitan systems, but not often here. So you've got the behaviors are the local trends. What's going on in the community environment? Just, how are people building their own houses? All those things that add up. And last but not least is, it'll never show up, is what's happening at the individual level. And to be explicit about the continuum, when we talk about policy change, at a national or large-scale level, we're talking about action here. But when you're looking at obesity or other health conditions of the individual, that lives here. So depending on your perspective, I've either illuminated or depressed you as you've given thought to the fact that these are all in play. Now, the good news is we don't need to all be working on all those things, but what we do need and have the benefit of doing is that we can work together as a network, whether you call it collective impact or whatever else, to leverage these factors to achieve the changes if we're clear about and embrace that approach, the changes we're trying to see and be in the community. So what does that mean? My colleague David Brown, who used to be at Harvard, is now doing else. What does this mean for us next? You're here, you're doing this, I commend you for that. It starts with focusing on, well, what is the reality? What are the forces in play? What is the whole system? Broadening our perception, figuring out where are our assumptions. This is part of that logic model notion. What assumptions do you work from that are either not consistent with or maybe they're even inconsistent with the environment that you're trying to affect things? What is our purpose? We need clarity and shared purpose and vision about what it is that goes on so that we can then design principles to orchestrate and connect the dots for all of us. And then we grow the systems to actually facilitate that, enable that to happen. That all happens on the way to creating new programs, new practices, new structures. It's exciting to see the work that's being done and I'm delighted to have had the chance to observe and work with Children's Mercy on a few of these things here. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate the chance to share this map perspective with you.